Okay, well, we are live. We are live. We are live. And I am Sandy Shellis, and I have a guest tonight, Dr. David Lewis. And welcome, David. This is really cool.
Thanks
I,
for
I,
inviting me.
yeah, I am inviting you. I did invite you. People are going to join. Um, I met you this summer. You are a friend of our follower and good friends, Basil and Karen. You call him George. And it's just great how people meet and interact. And guys, I'm going to, as you join, Karen's with us. I'm going to put her in the broadcast and say hi. She says, ciao, family. And Buddy, everybody's going to come in and join as I talk about who you are, since I did not make a video. And then we're going to give David the floor. David is the coolest guest. I'm telling you, he's really interesting. Lots of good stuff tonight. We're going to have a great conversation. David works at he's got a PhD. He's an assistant professor of geography and planning at the University of Albany SUNY. So SUNY's got my heart because I'm a SUNY person, and affiliated faculty with the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy and the Lewis Mumford Center. Well, I am going to give this to David to tell us exactly what that all meant. No, David, welcome. Welcome to Environmental Coffee House. People are joining. Tell us who you are and let's talk about life, because that's what you teach, basically.
I try anyway. So, well, thanks again for inviting me, Sandy. It was a pleasure meeting you this summer and your husband. And I don't know how you hooked up with Basil and Karen as you have, but when I met him, he was going by George or Jorge. So, um, but that was 40 years ago almost. So
Wow.
that was a
Wow.
while ago.
Yeah.
Um, so, what does it mean to be a PhD in teaching in the Department of Geography and Planning and associated with public affairs in the Lewis Mumford Center? For anybody who knows anything about Lewis Mumford, he was an urban critic. And so obviously having a center that his family was involved in setting up at the university, I teach in urban areas. And so it makes sense to be connected to that. It's just a place where people who are interested in researching urban issues
Yep.
collect and talk about different ways in which we look at urban places. The school, Rockefeller School of Public Affairs, is mostly known for producing people who work in government
Okay.
through their public administration and public policy programs. They do have a PhD program in political science, but they're primarily geared towards training people to work in government. And our department, Geography and
Awesome.
Planning, we're really focused on a master's degree in planning at an accredited school such as I'm at is really geared towards training the next generation of people who plan our communities, who determine
And
what our zoning's going to look like, where our roads are, what kind of density, are we going to protect and buffer streams. And so I got involved in this a lot later in life. This is my third career, and so I wasn't a full-time academic until I was 40.
yeah, yes.
And I got involved because I thought that back when I started to think about this and went to school to get the degree in 95, there was still a chance that humanity had to change its ways to live more sustainably and more socially just. And I thought training the next generation of planners to be engaged in that process, to change the way we interact with communities and how we physically orient our lives in relationship to the earth, that we could incrementally improve this and live in better communities. Obviously, with once an inconvenient truth came out, I radically changed my lifestyle in response, but the rest of the world didn't, and
Mm-hmm.
now we're here where we are. And I don't think that incremental change is the solution. I think that yes, we're probably climate change is going to happen. What we can do now is just try to reduce the suffering of billions who weren't the cause of this thing. And so about 60% of the planet doesn't use petroleum at all, and they're the ones who are going to suffer. In the United States, we're 4% of the population, and we produce about 30% of the greenhouse gases in the world.
Yeah,
And
don't
I
we?
think, we have the wealth and the power to ensure that people don't suffer as much as they will. And so I'm still working towards that goal, but recognize that my original vision of building a sustainable Earth is not going to happen. So that's how I got
Okay.
here.
Well,
That's
I've
what
already
I
got a
teach.
question. Are we doomed, David? See, I told you we've got a tough crowd there. Are we doomed, David?
Are we
No,
doomed?
no. Are we doomed? It depends on what you
I'm not
mean.
seeing the. Excuse me.
No, I'm talking to Rich out in the audience. It depends on what he means doomed in so many ways. I'm sitting with a picture of your David's garden behind me. So does that look doomed today? No, it looks beautiful. David's sitting with a picture of his home behind him. Somebody asked earlier if that was your bug out cabin.
No, that's where I
Yeah.
live full time.
Yeah,
But,
we're going to go into that because it's
as
really
I
cool.
said, I changed my lifestyle with, as I get new knowledge and being an educator. I mean, one of the things that I was really anti-university when I first started at Rutgers in 1980. By the time I was a senior, I was pretty convinced that universities didn't have the answers. And the reason for that is I went through Rutgers at a time when it was considered a very radical institution,
Oh, yeah.
but yet faculty who told me that they were pro-labor crossed the picket line when the support staff went on strike. And that pretty much convinced me that, I didn't want to be involved in the academy. I came from a small town. My dad worked for the railroads, lost his job when Amtrak came in. They stole the pension, and he went to work for Bethlehem Steel. And when Bethlehem
Oh,
Steel went belly up, he was unemployed from that point at 55 on. This was in the Reagan era. They took away my money to go to school because I made too much money at $7,000 a year
it
to get
started
funded.
to end in the Reagan era. The,
Yeah.
the, the era of not caring about
So
the
and
middle
that
class and the poor
and
guys.
that gets connected to where I am now because when I originally went to school, I was interested in renewable energy. I was an electrical engineering major, but by the time I graduated, Reagan had taken the solar panels off the White House, and 60% of the people working in electrical engineering were doing defense contracting. And so I left the school before graduating, went to Cape May and restored Victorian homes for 2 years before going
Oh,
back to
that's kind of
school and
interesting.
putzed around as a carpenter, a landscaper, a political organizer. Finally got my degree 9 years after I started, and I went self-employed as a general contractor. And then, so academia wasn't my first choice. Academia
Wasn't
was,
first.
well, what do you do when, I didn't want to be a carpenter the rest of my life. My wife asked me when I was 33, is this what you want to do the rest of your life? And I couldn't say yes. And so I thought about, well, what do I want to do? And what I did as a general contractor is I worked in existing urban neighborhoods in New Jersey.
Hmm.
I wouldn't do any kind of footprint. I wouldn't do any new construction. I would do additions, but you had to go vertical. You couldn't go out. I
Oh,
restored
wild.
existing homes. The idea is to restore our urban places, to build homes for people where we already need where people were, as opposed to out in suburbia. But every time I did it, these homes got gentrified. And well, I said, well, this isn't making you happy. What do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to teach people actually how to build sustainable communities because you can't do it on your own. More people need to be engaged in this process. And so
Okay.
I looked around and said, well, okay, well, what do I got to get a degree in to do that? And I went back to Rutgers and got a degree, first a master's in regional and urban planning, and then I went on and got my PhD because I really wanted to teach and not be an academic in an ivory tower, but out engaged in the world and trying to solve the world's problems. So that's how I got to
That's
where I am.
awesome. And for your students, that's a real benefit that you have experience out in life. As we were talking, you are out there. You've done all these things. You have all these skills to bring to the students, and that's great. I like the institution of teaching and learning, and all. So and we were also talking about what you're doing currently. I guess it would be interesting just to hear a little bit about how it is teaching right now in the COVID era. Just that little snippet.
Well, I think that's really different for everybody. I mean, what
Yeah.
I know about it from where I sit is, every institution's approaching it differently, and they all have different justifications for why they're doing what they're doing. Here at Albany, our plan is that, and I think in many ways I agree with, like, it's the instructor of record gets to choose what we refer to as the teaching modality.
Yeah.
And so you can choose to have your classes fully online, you can choose to have your classes fully in person, or you can choose to do a hybrid of some mix of the two. I selected to teach in person. And the reason I'm doing it in person is I like to build community, and I think it's really difficult to build community over the internet. I mean, I know obviously your organization, you've done it with this group of band of people, but
Hey,
I'm not.
band.
I'm
It's not a
I
lot tonight. I couldn't
when you're
share.
talking about young people exploring new ideas, the last thing I want to do is have somebody who feels uncomfortable to speak up because they're afraid of becoming an internet sensation for making a mistake or being uninformed about a subject, not because they're dumb, but because they grew up in this community and they don't know anything about that
About
other
that
community.
community.
And because of that, and
Yeah.
because we have such an awful an awful primary and secondary education system, it's impossible to learn about these things unless you have the freedom to make mistakes. And so I don't allow any recording in my classroom because it's all discussion based. I don't stand up there and lecture to students. We read material, and then I ask for people think about the material and then try to get to the root of, well, why is it? So one of the classes I'm teaching this semester is on the politics and energy of renewable, the politics and economics of renewable energy. Why is it that we've known for over a century
Yep.
that we could do this with solar energy? The first solar energy we're using was in 1905. A Frenchman built it, and we just hid that technology.
Hit it.
Jimmy Carter's policies in 1976, if we'd actually carried them out, we'd have been fossil fuel free by 2000. But we didn't. Why? And what is that?
You make me
Why is
cry.
that? Excuse me?
It makes me feel like crying. I mean, it's like this
Yeah,
emotional thing. We could have been. It could
yeah,
have, would have. Oh,
yeah.
Lord. That's a
So,
heavy statement.
yeah. And then now, I mean, the other class I'm teaching is on environmental racism. And, the topic of environmental racism brings up all kinds of painful issues about Black Lives
Sure.
Matter, brings all kinds of painful issues about inequality, brings up all kinds of painful issues about, people's ability to participate in a democratic society. And if people don't feel comfortable and that they're afraid to talk because, let's face it, the internet can be an awful thing. And
Yeah.
yeah,
We
it's
try
good
hard
to
not to have
expose
it.
people who do awful things, but when you're trying to learn something, being ignorant just means being uninformed. It's not a bad thing to be uninformed if you're willing to learn. It's the willful ignorance of Americans that really pisses me off. That we willfully want to be ignorant about our impacts of our consumption
Boy,
of
isn't that the
carbon-based
truth?
fuels. And that is something that I find really painful. So I work with climate scientists who fly 5, 6 times a year. One flight, one flight in America, one American flying. That's the equivalent of if we averaged out everybody's carbon footprint of the 7 billion people who live on the planet, almost 8 billion people who live on the planet now. One flight, if everybody flew once, we'd be over our carbon budget as a planet. And so I stopped flying because I can't justify my flying wasn't changing anything except I got to feel good about going to conferences and people being interested in
Oh
my
my
work.
God, I know that's what I went through. I told you I was the
Yeah,
traveling person all over the place. I never gave a second thought until I friggin' woke up, and I think I woke up too late.
yeah. So it's
Yeah,
so teaching in the
I
COVID
understand it.
era is different for everybody. The other thing I would say is that I'm at a research university. I think that probably my experience of being at a research university, whether it be at Rutgers, where I was there for 20 years, or here, I'm almost 20 years here, 20 years, is that probably 50% of the faculty, they don't want to be teaching anyway. They want to be scholars. And, so for me, I think they're okay with, I can go online and be distant from my students. That's fine because they want to be in their labs or they want to be doing their research or they want to be doing their writing.
Right.
And that's okay. We need people to do research. Absolutely. So I think the experience really depends on why are you at an academic institution? What's your goals? And again, my goal is to educate people about how to live sustainably and build socially just communities. And so I think that requires interaction with people. I mean, before being an academic, I was a political organizer. I've remained a political organizer. I only gotten paid for it twice, but I started, registering voters with the Rainbow Coalition in 1982. And I haven't stopped since. And
No, you
so,
walk the walk.
it's
Good
and
thing.
I don't do it because I get paid. I'm not a paid activist, as a lot of people in the world like. Oh, those are just paid activists. It's like, no, I'm a citizen. If you read democratic theory, right? Democratic theory suggests that the way democracies work are by having educated, informed, active citizens.
Well, then
So
I
I
guess
got
the United
educated,
States is not.
I got informed, and that makes me a citizen, not an activist. And I've
Okay.
never gotten paid. I didn't get paid by the Rainbow Coalition. I didn't get paid by the divestment movement. I didn't get paid when I was working in the sanctuary movement. I didn't get paid for any of the work that I did in the Obama campaign, Jerry Brown campaign. I was a national delegate convention for the Jerry Brown campaign in '92. I could tell you a lot about the Clinton organization. I've gotten
Oh
paid
boy.
none of that. It's all been volunteer work because that's what citizens do.
Yes.
And if you want to complain about our society, then do something. One of the greatest quotes
Yeah,
I've
that's
ever
kind
heard,
of
I don't know where it
true.
came from, was, I walk into the demonstration. This was back in the Reagan era. I was at a demonstration in Washington, D.C., and somebody was holding up a sign that said, somebody should do something about this. And then below it said, I'm somebody.
I'm
And that really
somebody.
resonated with me. And I've seen that sign over and over again at demonstrations. Last time I saw it was at a climate change demonstration. And, that's the truth. We're all somebody. And it's not one person has to do something, it's we all have to do it. And so I don't know if people know the story, but in 1970, the first Earth Day, April 20th, 1970, what happened was 20 million people went in the streets. First Earth Day.
20
20
million.
million. Less than a year later, we got an EPA under a Republican administration of Richard Nixon.
Mm.
That's how change happens. It doesn't happen by one person. It doesn't happen by leadership. They're not your leaders, they're your representatives. And they don't represent you unless you tell them what you want. And so that's how I got to where I am. I try to engage
Tell them
people
what
in
you
that,
want.
not by, I don't care what side of the issue you're on. Get informed. I just happen to think the facts point that, we can do something about the environment. We can build a better society. And I think the facts are on the side of, what most people would say are more progressive ideas. That when we have less inequality, we have less social ills. It's very clear societies that have less inequality have less violence, less people in jail, less obesity, less teen unmarried pregnancies, less people who are mentally ill, less drug abuse,
Mm-hmm.
better educational output, longer lifespans, happier populations. And it has to do with, if people have the capacity to support themselves, they're going to be happier. I mean,
David, can I ask you a question about do you you've heard of the degrowth movement?
the degrowth,
Degrowth that pull in capitalism, not keep unlimited growth
yeah,
on, the old saying, the unlimited growth on a finite planet.
yeah.
And I wonder, as you are a planner, what you're in your field, is that ever talked about, or is growth an issue? Is it more like
Well, here's the interesting thing. There was this thing that we called sustainable development, and
yeah.
that was a more global thing. In the United States, development got converted into what we call smart growth. We still had to grow because we're Americans.
Oh.
And
Oh.
so, yeah, it is talked about. It is an underlying assumption in our society that if the stock market's not growing, somehow we're doing badly. But the reality is that six people, the six richest people on the planet, have the
Yeah.
wealth of the poorest 3.5 billion. I don't think we need to grow. I think we need to redistribute. And that's
Yeah,
the
there you
reality.
go. There you
We
go.
don't need to grow. And there's also this difference between what is growth versus development, right? Growth is I get taller, I get fatter, I get larger, we get more. Development
Yeah.
is I mature, I do things more effectively, more efficiently, right? Think of it as like I go through grade school and I graduate and I mature. That's development. We need development, not growth.
You're
What we
such a
also
doer.
know, excuse me?
You're such a doer. It's good. I'm really enjoying listening to this. You're out there.
So,
You're really out there. You're a doer right now. We do. We need people to help us find the way
yeah.
because we're on the way somewhere. Well, with all of the events of storms and climate change and fires. And do you guys talk about elements in the atmospheric conditions of where you're planning for people to live?
Um, yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're talking about development, one of the ways to sort of to define planning, I mean, if you look at the planning code of ethics, you're supposed to look at 7 generations into the future of the impacts of the decisions you make today. And so, but one of the ways to sort of think about planning is human activity is always going to have an impact on the globe and impact on environmental systems. It's just the nature of human existence at this point in time. The question is can we have human activity that enhances that what we refer to as the positive externalities of development, or are we going to have development that produces a lot of negative externalities? And so, a big example, the example I use in my classroom would be a positive externality of development would be instead of building that facility 5 miles outside of town where people have to use single occupancy vehicles to get there, we have to build 10 miles of road to get there, we have to salt the road. If we built that facility where people can get through multimodal transit, where we improve people's health because they can walk there, we improve the environment because we stop carbon pollution, and we actually add value to the existing properties around it, where that value is then shared by the community, then we're enhancing the positive externalities of development. And so planning is the art of doing development that enhances things as opposed to destroy things.
Okay.
And so then, when Kunstler talks about the geography of nowhere and he says that the suburbs are unplanned, he's wrong. Every one of those suburbs were planned. They were planned using Euclidean single-use zoning districts, and that's why they are the way they are. By law, they got pushed that way. It wasn't unplanned. And if you go back and look at the reasons why we built those things, they were built for two primary reasons the way they are. One is for economic boost to ensure that there'd be demand for automobiles and gasoline and
Mm-hmm.
development materials. And the other is racist policy so white people could escape the cities based on their racist ideologies. And
Exactly.
that's
It
the
bingo.
reality. And if you go read this book called The Color of Law, it lays out this history. But you could also go read American Apartheid, which is another book that lays out this history of why we have white suburbs that segregated people by race and by class, but mostly by race. And so when you know that history, then you got to think, well, okay, well, what does that mean for like building sustainable communities today? But if you think that this all happened about, but it all was just a bunch of individual people choosing things in a private fair market process,
Right.
if that's the way you're seeing it, if you have that distorted view and you never get to the underlying law, well, then you're never going to change it because the law is always going to dictate the development pattern. Because by law, you couldn't build multifamily homes out there. By law, you couldn't lend people money to build houses in community that had majority black people in it. Like these were the laws. They weren't market choices. They weren't individual choices.
Social engineering gone
Yeah.
wrong.
So, and unfortunately, it was by one of what Americans think was a very progressive president under FDR. He's the one who came up with these under the New Deal era. That's where we got federal housing policy. That's where we got redlining from. That's when we got suburbs. And so that's the reality. Even progressives in America were racist.
Wow.
And
Yeah,
so
I'm not wowing. I know.
Yeah, it's disturbing.
It's,
Yeah.
it's disturbing, but it seems like the foundation of humanity is to not like the other one, you know?
Yeah, at least here, right? That's what we've grown up in America, the rugged individualist, right?
Yeah.
But but I've been other places, and I've been to places in the United States. Like I grew up in a small rural town. We were poor. I grew up in rural poverty. We worked collectively. I mean,
Mm.
I use an Amish example, right? They do barn building together. Like there are communities that does. I mean, we had this back to the land movement in the '70s where they were building communes. And if you go back even further, Eugene Debs, a socialist, ran for
Yeah.
president, got 30% of the vote in 1918. Like we aren't always a selfish society. Like that's not the history of America. That is a much more recent thing about being such a selfish society. It's really post World War II
Yeah.
that up until then, I mean, look in the 1930s. I mean, the Communist Party was big in the 1930s. If it wasn't for leadership of the Communist Party during World War II, the American oil workers were going to go out on strike as we were entering into World War II. And the Communist Party stood up and they had a big role in it and said, we shouldn't go on strike, we should beat Hitler.
Yeah.
It was
There you go.
so that's the reality, but this is not a history we teach in American schools. I couldn't believe the crap I was taught when I was in high school about American history. And it was a pure fiction. We were, we came here and the Europeans civilized the land.
Oh, I know.
I was
I
like, what?
remember it because I had the same education in the
Yeah.
1970s, right? I had
And
the
it
same stuff, and probably my kid. Well, no, I think my daughter got a little bit of a different.
Things have gotten a little bit better, but we have the same push. I mean, in Texas, they don't want to use the word slavery in high school textbooks anymore. They don't want to use the
Yeah.
word capitalism in high school textbooks anymore. How are we going to solve the problems unless we identify for them what they are? And so there is always a battle about, and if we think about where education comes from,
Hmm.
most people think it's public education, but it wasn't a public education law when it was passed in it's about 1870, somewhere in there. It's actually, it's compulsory education. The concern was by white middle class liberals is that these Europeans that were coming into the United States around them were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and they were bringing these foreign ideas of socialism and anarchy. Oh my God, we couldn't have those kids raised in those families. We needed to get them out and Americanize them. And so we got compulsory education. And that's the foundation of our public education system.
Wow. And how
Oh,
about this question? Why do we need such a huge military? That kind of singles in. We have education and military.
well, I worked on defense conversion in the late 90s and early 2000s, and I don't know how much your audience knows, but the American military defense system spends almost $1 trillion a year at this point. Almost $1 trillion is their budget. And that compared to all others, including our friends like England and France and Germany and Japan, that is more than the next top 5 spenders together. And if we want to say our enemies, Russia, North Korea, Iran, our budget dwarfs them by an order of magnitude. It's not even close. And so the idea that
And
we need to spend more there, it's just not true.
we need a tax revolt, but then the MMT people say, no, that won't work.
Who says that?
The MMT, modern monetary theory. Am I
Oh.
too low? I'm always trying not to
No,
know.
I just didn't hear MMT. I just didn't hear, and I'm not
MMT
familiar
is
with the acronym.
it's the acronym is modern monetary theory. There's a
Yeah.
book. Stephanie Kelton just came out with the book
Yeah.
explaining it, how we can write the blank check for the things we need, and why we're not getting Medicare for all. Basically, we can afford to have Medicare for all and all
Yeah,
of
if
the things
Exxon
we
would pay
want.
some
And that,
goddamn taxes, we could.
yeah,
But
well,
Exxon actually gets a tax rebate. They made $34 billion and got a tax rebate. We argue, you'll hear politicians in America argue that, We have the highest taxes in every industrialized nation. And what they're really saying is that, yes, if you talk about the legislative rate of taxation, we say that business taxes are 35%. But then they have all these write offs. And what
Absolutely.
is the effective rate, what they actually pay, is the lowest in any industrialized nation. See, in Europe, they don't have taxes and write offs, they have a value added tax.
Yeah, it's
There's no
more
write off.
simplified.
It's simplified, it's straightforward, and it's based on the additional value you have on processing some economic good. It's not, well, Exxon gets write offs for all kinds of things. They get write offs to pollute the earth. They get write offs to go
Yeah.
drill new wells we don't need. They get write
Jeez.
offs for doing research and development on petroleum products. If we put the money that we did in fossil fuels into renewable energy, if we took all the money that we spend on subsidizing Exxon and put it into renewable energy, we would be off fossil fuels in 5 years. That's the reality. The reality is that we've been subsidizing oil, coal since 1905. There is no sunset in any of the tax breaks for them. We've been subsidizing nuclear from day one.
Mm.
There wouldn't be a single nuclear power plant in America if we repealed the Price-Anderson Act. Price-Anderson Act provides all the insurance for every nuclear power plant in the United States. There's not a private market actor who would
Holy
insure
crap.
a nuclear power plant. So if we want
Wow.
to say let the market choose, then let's take away the Price-Anderson Act and see how fast nuclear power plants close, because they won't be able to get private insurance.
Yeah, but they have to be able to clean up after they close. There's still a mess they always leave.
Yeah, but that's still a problem. But the reality is
Yeah.
the argument
At least
that
they
we
would be
hear about
done.
this is, well, we have to subsidize renewable energy. The renewable energy doesn't get anywhere near the subsidies of nuclear or coal or oil, and they haven't gotten them for a century. All those industries get subsidies, and they've been getting them for a century. So if you want to make the argument about subsidizing and free market actors, then we need to take away the subsidies from the firms and the industries that have been getting them for a century. Not the ones that are starting up,
Yeah.
but the ones that have been around for a century. Shouldn't they be able to operate without subsidies at this point?
Yes. It's
That's
just,
market theory. That's what they
yeah.
told me in economics.
Somebody
So,
made a comment before
yeah.
about reading Howard Zinn. Yes,
Yeah, Howard's is a
absolutely.
good one.
Yes.
I wish I'd gotten that when I was 16. Maybe I wouldn't have been so screwed up. So, but
Well,
I mean, I
who
was
wasn't?
crazy.
Everybody was screwed up for a certain amount of time, probably everybody in our audience. And that defines what is your definition of screwed up?
Oh, I was antisocial. I was self-destructive. Um, yeah, I had no clue. Like I didn't want to participate in society. I just felt like,
Well, you grew up.
no. Well, I mean, look, I wanted to remove myself from the historical process and go to Alaska and homestead so I wouldn't have to talk to people. You
That's what
know,
you and Basil were supposed to do together, who is in our
yeah.
audience, who is your good friend
Yeah.
of 40 years. I
And
see, I
so,
know they're
and
here.
I mean, the human species not built to be a hermit. And so, I mean, I'm not saying, yeah, okay, everybody's
I'm a
biology is
hermit.
slightly differently, but if there were 8 billion hermits on the planet, we wouldn't have cities,
Yeah, and
right?
you plan cities so that people could live cooperatively and almost like communally.
Yeah, that's the, yeah.
That's the goal is to and but we can't keep growing. We cannot keep growing. The earth is
No,
not
we
going to
need
be
to
able to
develop.
sustain 8 billion people.
The
10
other thing
billion
we know
people.
about development is that when people get more educated, what we also know is they start to make better choices. And one of those better choices is when you get more educated and you have enough wealth where you can feel secure, then birth rates go down. Well, one of the biggest problems in right now is the earth isn't built to support 10 billion people, but we're going to have 10 billion people in the next 10 years. Well, if we had more distributed wealth and more distributed education, what we know in every country that it's ever gotten better health, better
Yeah.
education, and better wealth,
Yeah.
birth rates have declined
Yeah.
everywhere it's ever happened. everywhere over time, not just in the modern period. But you can go back to the Roman Empire, go back to Greece. People get educated and have enough security. And well, why do you have so many children? Well, it's in part because you need that many children to ensure that you're going to be able to survive economically. Who's going to take care of you if you don't have a welfare system? If you don't have Social Security? Who takes care of you in the older age? So if you're in a farm, rural community, you have lots of children because that's how you survive.
The
When
Amish do here. Lots of
no,
children.
it's true everywhere. I mean, and so when you add wealth and education, all of a sudden you see birth rates decline, and we wouldn't have such a skyrocketing birth rate if we had more distributed wealth and more distributed justice. And that's, these are the facts. They're not, I mean, people might say I'm biased, but all I'm doing is laying out what the facts are and making an
Absolutely.
educated decision about what that means. If you want
Biased
to
about
grow
what?
population,
Oh.
then we need to redistribute wealth and educate people. And
I
that's
agree. Do you think we can do this? Do you think there's the political will to do this? Do you think that we have time with the Arctic melting? I mean, here I
well,
bring my gloom and doom in,
that's a
but
really. Do we have the political will? I I think that um, I think that the political will could be there. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I certainly have
oh,
tried. As I said, I started with the Rainbow Coalition. I worked, I've been in basically, I mean, I've involved the anti-war movement. I was involved in, divestment. I was involved in sanctuary movement. I was involved in Occupy Wall Street. I mean, we have a lot of progressive thinkers and a lot of people are willing to engage. The problem isn't at the grassroots level. The problem is at the affluent white middle class American being so goddamn afraid of change, and that's the reality.
man, and a lot of them I hate to say is our age, my age. Well, I'm older than you, but it's still I don't know. Do you ever get the every now and then there's a comment left on a stream about it's all our fault and it's all of the boomers and we did this to them and the not all the time but younger ones. Do you
Yeah.
ever come across that in your career with students or students for the
Oh,
most part?
I'm straightforward with my students. I said my generation failed you. They were the flower power generation. Bill Clinton didn't do anything for you.
No.
Bill Clinton screwed you. Bill Clinton moved us to the right. Bill Clinton took on labor and pushed NAFTA through despite labor unions saying this is not going to be good for us. Bill Clinton brought us three strikes you're out. Bill Clinton brought us welfare reform. Bill Clinton got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act, which led to the financial collapse in 2018. Bill Clinton did
This is
Bill Clinton
painful.
college children. He brought us the Telecommunications Act of 1995, which resulted in the monopolies of not just phone lines, but every form of media now. It used to be illegal for one company to have every form of media outlet in one town. But Bill Clinton changed that. He was a progressive. He was a liberal. He didn't want to tax the rich. He cut taxes on corporations. He cut taxes on wealthy people. So yeah, the flower power children left us down. They
Yeah.
got rich. They got comfortable. This is, the American affluence has a way of co-opting people. And that's, I mean, like I said, when I started at Rutgers, I was shocked by these faculty people who told me they were progressive. They told me they were pro-union. They told me they were pro-labor. They told me they were socialists. They told me they were communists. But when the people who cleaned the bathrooms and cut the lawns went on strike, they crossed the picket line.
Wow. And my husband is one that cleans the bathrooms.
Yeah, well, so have
Not by
I.
total choice, but he
I
has to do it. That's what happens. And, when you
know,
get
my
older and you
dad
can't
was
go on roofs.
railroad worker union, then he was a steel worker. I was in the Teamsters.
Yeah.
You don't
Yeah.
cross picket lines. No,
No.
no. If you're with labor, you don't cross a picket line.
Oh,
But
David.
so,
So how do you remedy that? You're an
mm,
educator. You're trying to remedy it by maybe giving some skills and uh,
well, for me, it's always been about
success.
volunteer. It's about being a citizen. It's about getting educated. Don't depend on the media to educate you. The media doesn't have your interest at heart. I mean, the New York Times 5 years ago was still telling us that it was technologically impossible to go to renewable energy. This is an outright lie. National Academy of Science in 2007 wrote a report that said we could use technology from 2000 and we could be off, our grid could be 100% by wind and solar, and we'd have 11 times more energy than we currently consumed at that point. That was in 2007.
Right.
5 years ago, the New York Times was still telling us it's technologically impossible. Germany has already gotten rid of every one of their nuclear power plants, and they've gotten rid of down to 30% of their coal production from 2000 in terms of energy production. They are almost fully renewable, and it's much, much harder to produce solar energy in Germany. They got the solar profile of Alaska.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of, your
So-
house looks like somebody had made a comment and said, "What is he in Siberia?" Because you put the snow picture up.
It
I
is
just thought-
upstate New York. It's in the Finger
Yeah.
Lakes.
It's beautiful. You know what? Can we segue? Because now that you
Absolutely.
got into the lifestyle and talking about solar, your house is completely carbon free.
Not quite. We're getting there.
Okay.
We do have we
And
we
I've got
are
pictures I'm gonna show while you
100%
talk.
off the grid. You want to
Okay.
go ahead and bring up the images?
I'm going to, while you talk, I'm going to
Okay.
just put them up on my side. I'm going
Okay.
to I'm going to start with you talk about off the grid, and then I'll put pictures up and just tell you the start
Sure.
one is water
So
collection.
The house that we built is a log cabin. It's white pine, and it's completely off the grid. We get probably from March, about the middle of March to the middle of October, we are 100% solar. We don't have any fossil fuels. We don't use anything for heating. And if we wanted to run an air conditioner, it'd be run off of solar, but we don't even need an air conditioner usually. But everything is solar. And then when we get to the upstate New York cloudy season that starts in October and runs to March, our generator, as we move further into the winter, might run once a week, twice a week, to the point where when we get to the depths of winter, it's running every day. It runs for about 2 hours. It charges our batteries, and then we use the
Okay.
batteries the rest of the time. And so we do use propane for that period. We heat primarily with wood. We have a masonry stove, which is 6,600 pounds of soapstone.
It's
And
beautiful. I've
it's a
got the picture
masonry
up.
stove. It's not a fireplace. So what that means is that it's 6,600 pounds of soapstone, but there's what it's called a 5-channel stove. So when we charge it, the way it operates is you burn twice a day. You put in roughly 22 pounds of wood, 26 pounds of wood. You burn it as hot and as fast as possible. And then you shut the flues down. And then all those gases circulate in these channels inside the stove, heating the stove. And so the burn temperature is about 1,200 to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. My stack temperature is roughly about 200. By the time the gases are actually leaving my stove, all that energy is absorbed by the soapstone and then slowly radiates out. And then 12 hours later, you put another charge in. And so we burn roughly, last winter, we burned 2.5 cords of wood to heat our house, and that was supplemented by a propane forced hot air system, which once we put in a second stove, that'll go away. We just didn't have the money to build it. The cost of the stove was to build it, get the prints, import the stone. We hired somebody to do it. I didn't do that myself. It was roughly about $18,000. I just didn't have the money to do. I want to put in eventually in the basement where I'm going to put a rocket stove in that I'll do myself. Just haven't gotten there yet. And then that'll make the propane heat, really secondary. That we just need to get heat real quick. Maybe we'll turn it on, but we won't be needed to supplement the masonry stove anymore. That'll be supplemented by a rocket stove in the basement.
How long have you planning this dream? How long have you been planning this dream?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. The initial dream was when I was 13 during the oil crisis. I bet my cousin that I'd build a house off the grid and not be dependent on on energy companies because
Okay.
I thought energy companies were evil. So, so yeah, it's been a long time. I'm 57 now. So I've been thinking about this. Originally, I thought I'd be doing hydro. When I was 13, my grandfather was an electrician, and I worked with him, and I understood that, an electric motor is essentially magnets and a coil of wire, copper wire. And the way in which we generate electricity is that you have permanent magnets and you spin copper wire inside of it, and the interface of the magnetic fields with the copper wire actually pushes electrons out of the copper wire and down. That's how we generate electricity. And so how you spin that in the armature of that generator can be done with wind, it can be done with solar, it can be done with a lot of different ways other than heating water and shooting steam through it, which is the way we do it when you burn coal, you burn oil, you burn natural gas. It's actually the way a nuclear power plant works as well. It's the in the decay of nuclear fuel that gets really hot when in a fission process, and that heat is used then to boil water to push a turbine. And so
Wow.
I lived on two rivers. We had various different small creeks around us that had falling water. I thought, well, this is pretty easy. I can set up a hydro system to generate electricity and live off the grid. I was 13.
Dang.
I didn't think it was all that complicated then. I still don't think it's that complicated today. So,
Yeah, but it would be a bit complicated to do that in a city if you're planning a
yeah,
development. What would you
yeah.
do to plan for, let's say, I showed all the pictures of your different things, your batteries and all. I don't know why and everybody liked your fireplace. And they're having quite a chat in there because Sam's in the chat. And so
Uh-huh.
he's keeping everybody busy. I just started looking at it. It seems like
Well,
they're
how about
having
I
fun.
take some questions from your audience?
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions about uh, anything? Solar, what he's got, his setup, education, anything. We have a lag for me to see it, but if we got a
That's okay.
question, let's see. Um, I, indoor aquaponics. I don't know what that
Oh,
means.
indoor aquaponics. That's interesting. I helped
Indoor,
Rutgers. Excuse
or
me.
okay, there's a few. Indoor aquaponics, and then Scott's it's all from Scott. Re-engineer services in urban communities. What
Yeah.
is all right, what is re-engineer services and re-engineering
I'm not
services?
sure what he's talking about. Re-engineered? Is he talking about re-engineered environmental services?
Tiny home,
Environmental
100
services
acres.
being how we clean the environment, cleans the air, cleans the water, and produces cooling effect through having trees and precipitation of trees. Is that what he's referring to by re-engineered environmental services?
I don't know. Build our own rock ton. I don't know what that means. Okay, Val says, I have partial solar. I know it takes time, money, and effort to do it. Congrats, man.
Yeah. Well,
Val's
thank you.
cool. Yeah, he built his own stuff too. Um, okay, Gene says, um, ask about below ground cooling and heating. I'm curious. Is that
Okay.
like geothermal?
Geothermal would be one way that we would talk about. Geothermal is extracting heating or cooling properties from the natural differences in temperature between the surface of the Earth and
Okay.
below the Earth. Geothermal, what the reality is that geothermal has some really good qualities, but you really need to be in a place that has really high potential. And so, a place like Finland, with all its volcanic material,
Yeah.
they get about 30% of their energy from geothermal energy off of the volcanic magma, and they're using that as a source.
So they got to
Upstate New
drill?
York,
They got to drill
excuse
for
me,
that? The process,
yeah,
you got to drill for that.
you drill
Pretty far
into a
down.
vent of volcano and you extract the heat off the magma.
Yeah.
At Cornell, they do what's called lake source cooling,
Hmm.
which is a form of geothermal. And so Cornell has a intake pipe about 150 feet below the surface of Cornell or below Cayuga Lake, and then they pump that water out of the lake
I
and they
fix my
bring it
chair.
to a circulator, and then that circulator transmits its coolness to another body of water, and then that body of water is used and circulated through the buildings to cool the buildings, and then they pump the water back down into the lake and at the level where it's surface temperature, so it's not putting in hot water at the lower level, it's putting in the water at the level at which its temperature is going back. And I forget
Okay.
where, I think it's at like 60 feet is where their outline pipe is. And so that's another form where you have this huge reservoir of cool water and they're using it to cool buildings. And if you actually look at the technology of cooling buildings in the city, particularly New York City back in about 1890 to the 1950s,
Mm-hmm.
the primary way to cool a building was water. All those reservoirs, all that cold water in the reservoirs were then they would bring it in and they'd pump it through the buildings and then blow fans over the vented, and just like we do
And
with
it didn't dirty
baseboard hot
anything.
water heat, where you have these fins and then that was it, but it was cold water just running through pipes, and that's how you cooled buildings until we had air conditioning. And so Cornell does that with lake source cooling. Geothermal in upstate New York, it does have a long payback period. It's not quite as efficient as, obviously you're doing much better in, places that have large volcanic activity where you're
Yeah.
really extracting huge sources of energy.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you can do, and if you have huge sources of cool water like, Lake Cayuga or Lake Seneca or or those Great Lakes,
Yep.
they can be great sources. And yes, in the groundwater in my house is 52 degrees. And so if I'm sourcing that groundwater as a means for cooling, yes. And can heat pumps are okay, but the reality is those technologies aren't nearly as efficient as solar PV. If you look at solar PV, what we know scientifically, this is not opinion, is the Earth has roughly 510 quadrillion square feet or square meters of Earth, of land area. We know by measuring that on average, every square meter of the Earth, on average, from the poles to the equator, averaging it out, produces about 1 barrel of oil equivalency of energy every year. So that's 510 quadrillion barrels of oil of energy of sunlight every year. All right. Well, we can't cover the entire Earth with, and I'd love to share a graphic. Can I share a graphic? I do have a share screen. Let's see. What am I looking for? Should we
The
down?
problem is, I don't know if your share screen will show up on my software.
Oh, okay.
I don't think
Oh,
it
I'll
will.
handle it. So I'll
Yeah.
just go through basic math. Is essentially at 510 quadrillions of barrels of oil, the equivalent of energy. If you take 10% of the land area, that's 51 quadrillion. You say you're only 10% efficient with your solar panels, that's 5.1 quadrillion. You're only 10% efficient in transmitting that energy, that's 510 trillion barrels of oil of energy a year. Globally, we use about 100 million barrels of oil and energy every year. And we could be producing 500 trillion barrels of oil. It's orders of magnitude difference. We don't need any other source of energy. None. Zero. And there's this great graphic by Richard Perez where if you look at it and the size, it uses, circles, the one year worth of solar energy is 5 times all other finite sources of energy put together forever. So if you added up all the coal reserves, all the natural gas reserves, all the petroleum reserves, all of the uranium reserves, added them all up, 1 year's worth of the sun is 5 times the entire supply of every other fuel source.
Can that be sustainable in buildings in
Yeah,
those communities?
absolutely. I mean, the thing with solar is, and you'll hear these things like the arguments that we hear is, oh my God, when the solar panels run out, what are we going to do with that? What about the pollution from that? Well, they're made of silicone. They're not, I mean, there are some toxic chemicals that go into their production. We do need rare earth metals.
Yeah.
Yes, I do agree that there are some
And
issues,
so
but
it takes
you know how much
fossil
rare earth
fuels to
metals it
mine
takes
them.
to build a system that builds nuclear power plants? Why does anybody talk about the need for rare earth metals for that? What about the rare earth metals that are necessary to drill deep in the Arctic? What about that?
That's
What about, I
horrible.
mean, what about the pollution from burning fossil fuels? I mean, we need to like think about, yes, there are arguments that yes, solar panels do have some pollution, but if you compare that to the pollution of burning fossil fuels, it's not even close. People say, "Oh my God, windmills, they're bird blenders." If anybody knows the
Sorry.
statistics, windmills kill roughly about 300 to 500,000 birds annually.
Cats kill
Cats
more.
kill 3 million.
I have 5
Birds
cats. I don't
flying
let them.
into windows of buildings kills 2 million. I don't hear anybody arguing that we need to get rid of glass windows in buildings.
I do.
So,
I think that we need to get rid of all those buildings, but of course, I have a view. I think it's going to happen anyway.
I mean,
Despite
again,
our best efforts, David.
the arguments that are made against renewable energy, they never compare the impacts. They always just point out, well, yes, there's problems. I agree. I don't disagree that there's problems, but I also happen to know that instituting that will resolve so many others. And one of the biggest things, talking about bringing it back to social justice and communities, is renewable energy can be distributed. Imagine the power of poor people not having their electric shut off because they own their own solar panels. Wow, that's empowering. I grew up poor. I know what it's like to go without meals. I know what it's like to will we heat our house? Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, you
it's
can't turn my solar panel off. You can't turn the sun off, but they can cut your electric off tomorrow. Right? You don't have gas to put in your car. Well, we have an electric car. We primarily charge it at home on our solar panels. The hell with these energy companies. They don't have any
yeah.
power over me
I feel
anymore.
I wish. I have to go back to something, David, because
Yeah.
there was a comment,
Huh?
and I'm looking for it. Basil Peterson,
Okay.
your buddy, but it was a good comment. He wanted to know how somebody likes living off grid. Howard, how does Howard like living off grid? Was that the
Howard?
per? Wait, I have to look back. I can't find it.
Herman? Dad?
Herman, ask Dave what Herman thinks about living off grid. There it is.
Okay.
It's
All
the,
right,
it
so
sounds
this is
like a
an inside
personal
joke.
story.
This
Okay,
is
but
an
Basil
inside
brought it
joke,
up.
folks. Herman is our adopted puppy. He's no longer a puppy. He's
Oh.
now 8. And so the real story here goes back to we adopted Herman. He was a rescue from Alabama. We adopted him sight unseen. I drove to Scranton, Pennsylvania to pick him up from the Finger Lakes. Brought him home. I didn't take him, but at the time I was still living in the city of Ithaca. We brought him out to, at that time, George was not living full time at his house. He's my neighbor now. He was right across the street from me. I
Yeah.
brought him to George's place and we hung out at his house. And he thought he was moving in there. And every time I come out and visit George with Herman, Herman wouldn't get in my car to go home. I'd have to, it's
Oh.
embarrassing. So, Basil, I think he loves it.
Good. All right. I got another question, and then
Yeah.
I have two. Sandy, can you ask David how long does a solar panel last?
The technology now is that they degrade to about 80% of their initial production in about 25, 30 years. Some people say you need to replace them then. But, my solar panel, if it's at 80%, I mean, the internal combustion engine, if anybody doesn't know this, the internal combustion engine, the most efficient internal combustion engine is only about 28% efficient of taking the energy available in that gasoline and converting it into mechanical energy that turns your tires. So why would I throw away a panel that's 80% efficient? If I'm burning an internal, and if I actually take the measurement, what's called exergy, which is how much energy did it take me to actually get gasoline that I could burn, then the efficiency rate goes down to about 5%. So by the time I've drilled for the oil, transported it, refined it, put it in my car and burned it, of all the potential energy that I got out of that oil, I got about 5%. So why does anybody talk about the
5%.
inefficiency of internal combustion engines? Because they're willing to say, well, that solar panel is only 22% efficient. Well, your internal combustion engine's less than 5.
Yes, that's
So,
true.
and I'm getting it something that I don't have to pay for. Once I put my solar panel in, I don't pay a dime. The maintenance costs for my solar panels are when it snows, I go out and I scrape them.
Yeah, I would really rather see personally at all homes like yours, and I'm trying also, but
And for those who don't have off-grid capacity, I want to make this very clear.
yeah.
Many states, and I don't know where everybody is, but there's a lot of states now that have what they refer to as community-owned solar systems. And so in New York State, everywhere in New York State, you can buy into an existing solar farm and get 100% of your energy, not by putting solar panels on your house or putting them on the ground, but by buying into an existing solar farm that's owned by the community you live in. And you can do that, and it's cheaper than buying energy from NYSERDA. It's cheaper than buying energy from Mohawk. What is it? No, National Grid. Mohawk Energy doesn't exist. National Grid. It's cheaper than any of it. It's cheaper than Long Island Power. You can buy into community solar today in New York, anywhere in New York, and get cheaper energy. It'll be 100% solar, and you'll be an owner of a solar panel.
Our
Doesn't
energy.
if anybody wants to contact me, I will
Yeah.
hook you up with the
Okay.
community organizations that do it.
All right. That
If
sounds
you're
like
in
a
a different
plan.
state, I'd help you research it for you. This is what
That's
I do
nice.
for a living. This is what I do for education.
I love it.
So,
Let's see. Doctor. Oh, this is a can. I don't know. Do we want to go in this rabbit hole? Did Dr. David see Planet of the Humans? His reflection of the film, if he has seen it.
Planet of the Humans. I
That
haven't seen
was
it.
okay. That was the
I saw
Michael.
Planet of the Apes.
No, the
I thought
more
it was great.
Michael Moore movie. You have to see it. Where have you been?
Oh, okay. So I've heard of this film. I haven't seen it. Um, you know, I haven't seen it, so I won't. I've heard criticisms of it. I've heard praise of it, but I have not seen it. And
Okay.
who's it? I will watch it because I should be informed about it. Um, Michael Moore has been an interesting filmmaker. He has brought a lot of good things to light. His initial film, Roger and Me, was really powerful about, how corporations crush unions and don't care about their communities.
Right.
His work on healthcare I thought was wonderful. His work on Columbine I thought was really good. And so I think he deserves the respect before I should view his work before I critique it.
Okay, that's right on. You answered the question. Let me think. We have other questions. Oh, here's a good one. From Unapologetic Vegan. Wind turbine graveyards. Is there a better way to make them recycled or last longer?
Okay, so they're using mostly the turbine blades now are mostly fiberglass resins. Is one of them. They're going to carbon filament, which is also still pretty polluting. But there's a company out there that's pioneering balsa wood as a means, and so if they go a balsa wood construction, then they'd be totally biodegradable. So yeah, I mean it's possible, and what they're really talking about are these massive utility scale turbines. We don't necessarily, one of the problems with, from my point of view, again, of these massive institutionalized energy production systems is it doesn't give the power to the people. That's one of the things I really like about small micro hydro. It's what I like about micro wind. It's what I like about solar panels is that you don't need $500 billion to build a wind farm. You can build a solar farm for a couple $100,000. A community can get together and own their own energy system.
They
And
don't
then we
have to be
eliminate
that
large
big, do they?
corporations.
But they don't
Excuse me?
have to. They don't have to be that large. Do they have to be so
No.
large that they take
Well, the thing is
habitat?
that the larger you get what they call economies of scale, the larger you get more energy out of them than materials and money that you put into them. And so the economies of scale produce more profit, right? So that's what firms want. They want profit. And so they want to get bigger. The more money they can make out of every dollar they invest, the better. Whereas if you're doing it for your community and you think about, oh, this enables me to not pay bills to a private corporation which doesn't have my interest at heart. It allows me to produce energy from a clean source that doesn't harm other people. It allows me my own source of power where I'm not dependent on a private corporation who can take my power away because I got sick and couldn't pay my bill this month. Or a COVID crisis came and I lost my job for 6 months. Or whatever other scenario that people on the margin live with all the time. And if you have your own source of power, that goes away. And by providing people power, I mean, in terms of energy, you also provide them power as citizens. As people, it empowers them to be themselves. And so I'm much more into distributive energy than I am to large-scale wind farms, though they have a role, but it shouldn't be our primary investment, not my opinion. In fact, in Germany, one of the things about in Germany, not only are they moving towards renewable energy, but their solar system is so distributed that 40% of the energy on their grid is produced by consumers, households, farms across the country. Wow. There's a small rural town of Wisserpol, Germany, that produces 7 times more energy than it consumes. And it's farms and neighborhood villages. And they're putting that out on their grid, and that's what people do for a living in that community now.
Well, you know, David, I think this has been really interesting. We've been, okay, an hour and 7. We got good questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to recap. I think that we are still here till we're not. And you're demonstrating a different, a way forward, at least, that could help us until the inevitable. I think. I mean, I do. I don't see the Arctic melting and all those. No, I don't see any of these as good.
Climate change is coming. Sea level rise is coming. It's going to displace billions of people.
God,
the least we can do is try to reduce that harm, and we can reduce that harm by being citizens, and we're changing our consumption patterns.
There you go. Couldn't say it any more beautifully than that. Thank you so very much, and thank you everybody that came. And I'm going to end with this awesome unapologetic vegan said, educate until our last breath. And I think I try to bring people on that do. And this was
educate
great.
And agitate.
Educate and agitate. And Jean, thank you for coming. Osama, thank you. If I go into that question, how many humans does it take to kill a biosphere? No, we won't go there. Good night, everybody.
Apparently it only takes 6. They're called billionaires.
Yeah, there you go. That's a whole other evening. Good night, everybody. Thank you very much. We'll see you
Thanks, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Thursday for State of the Planet. Thanks. Hasta la vista.
Adios, folks.